Hi, I'm Brian, and this is part 4 in our series on code generators. In this one, we're specifically going to talk about concerns related to reuse and extensibility, and there is a little bit of crossover with SDLC, right? So, a quick review. We've got bicycles, we've got people, we've got a relationship between them. It looks like people buy them. Maybe we have some cardinality we can talk about. We've got input models in our project. We've got some templates. We've got some output. We're going to make SQL, Python, Java, governance docs. We got this all in one cool little repository. And our coworkers think that we are a miracle worker, right? Like with a swipe of our hand, we can go create a new little object and add it down here. So let's add pet, right? So all of a sudden we add pets and we have pet type, right? So we've got dog, cat, and bird. Maybe somebody's going to add snake later. We can have a whole discussion about change management in here. But with the swipe of our hand, we create pet, we add a few fields, and miraculously, we end up with a lot of different manifestations of it that are really useful to go implement real business logic, right? That's a key point, right? Remember, I said we often don't do DSLs and languages because we don't want to write a parser. Instead, we sort of skip up to this. We stick with structured text. Structured text is great for representing models, sort of state. But as soon as you get into a place where you say, well, I've got some structured text, it kind of looks like this, but I need if statements and loops. So if I need control flow, you can do it. Like there's examples in XML, there's examples in JSON, there's lots of examples in YAML. As soon as you need control flow, structured text becomes very challenging. The maintenance costs skyrocket, and looking at a DSL becomes much more interesting. So there's this subtlety that says, look, if you're using structured text, you're going to run through code generating. What you're probably doing is you're generating a lot of useful components, but the actual orchestration and business process layer, things that are more procedural, those are often not captured here. We're not capturing workflow, right? Although for what it's worth, there are structural languages in XML, BPMN, a couple others that are specifically designed to capture workflow in a structured language. And then they run that through this exact same kind of process and they produce Java and all kinds of other madness. Okay. So reuse, we have all this in our cool little project, but suddenly our friends want to declare pet not in our project. They say, hey, listen, we think this is super cool. We've done something horrible. We've copied and pasted your whole thing. And we've decided that, pet needs to belong in a different repo. So pet is out here. And maybe I want to redo all the same stuff for pet, but I don't want to add pet into this project. Maybe this project doesn't logically own the release cycle and the definition for pet, right? So I want to go import it. And now I've got this idea of, oh, I want to import that model, but I want to import that model at a version. So we're going to talk a little tiny bit about SDLC stuff, because what I'm really saying is now these models need to be stored in source control, and they may need to be versioned. And they, ideally they would be stored in some kind of artifact repository with version numbers. The reason why, of course, then you can import a model at a given version number and deterministically know what's going to come out the backside without needing to own the definition of it. That can be some other process or some other part of the organization. Conversely, and very frequently, like there's a very common tool right now that does a bunch of database code generation, and shareable templates is the other big thing that's important, right? So, object.sql is not here. Object.sql is owned by right? Object.sql is owned by some other team too. So these are two separate repos way off in space. And what you end up wanting, is the ability to reference templates. They need to be, remote. They probably ought to think about things like source control. They probably ought to have a similar versioning capability. There's a couple of considerations, and how do you package templates, and can the template author determine where output goes to make it easier in a given combination? So there's a lot of multiplicity when you get to reuse, but without it, you end up with, this ever growing sort of hairball. And the ability to separate collections of models from a governance standpoint becomes incredibly useful, because now I can say, hey, this is my, person bike model, and it's all together in one repo, and we can do code review, and everybody agrees, yep, that's the bike model. You could have different projects running different custom templates, building different subsections of this, then building their logic on top of it, and get very coordinated releases across a huge ecosystem, really tied to one base governed model, right? So when we talk about contract-based development, a lot of contract-based development, by the way, all that I just talked about, let's just say as an organization, you choose Swagger, right? Or OpenAPI. You say, hey, OpenAPI, that's our input model. It's nothing more than structured text, right? Like it's JSON or YAML, it's just structured text. It gives you the ability, now this is interesting, that structured text gives you the ability to define objects. So it has its own like object modeling, and it has its own type system, right? Like very well defined. And that's one of the things that you find. The more well-defined this is, and the more well thought through it is in terms of all your outputs, the more reuse you're going to get, right? And so you look at an open API file. By the way, this other subtlety, remember I said most of what we do with this is structural stuff. A lot of these really sort of more popular languages will not only define an object system like OpenAPI does, or like Protobuf does, or like Avro, or like Corba, they'll often also define service interfaces. So logical names of operations with parameters, the parameters usually being the types defined in the system. Because as it turns out, that saying, hey, I want to create person operation and a person buys bike operation, and they take people and bike, now I can generate more structure out here. Maybe I can generate API endpoints, right? So we do this all over the place, right? Like you might be building an entire ecosystem that's built on some code generators. Maybe these are all Protobuf, right? So Protobuf is an interesting subset. It is technically its own little DSL. It has its own little parser. The entire rendering engine is essentially closed, right? Like it's kind of there, but it's not easy to extend, right? Like in my opinion, really fails the extensibility test. Hard to add new stuff to that rendering pipeline. The outputs are, they are what they are, right? Really hard to create a new target. And so if you're looking at a code genning framework and you're looking at what should we use universally for object models across our organization, well, first, you're probably going to have more than one. You're probably going to have some open API specs, and you're probably going to have some internal service to service kind of things. Figuring out what those are and how many ways you can use them through code generation through your entire ecosystem, it's a big deal, right? Because it can be very limiting depending on what you choose as your input and how extensible this center section is. So extensibility includes, we talked a little bit about type overrides, a couple other ways you can do this. You can talk about model extensibility. So we won't go too deep into this because it requires more extensive pre-processing. But the idea is, I have pet, and pet gets imported into this project, but now I have pet extensions, and I'm going to customize pet, right? So like the normal pet object has, breed and weight, but down here, I'm going to add collar size. And so the ability to like merge those two models into a logical model, it's a little bit like you think about like a C or C++ macro, right? Like we're going to pre-process the models a little bit, and then we're going to send them into rendering. It's another way to do this extensibility, and it's another way to keep this kind of target specific stuff out of your core model. It can produce challenges because you can actually end up back in like a dual maintenance scenario where, oh, I added a field to this, but I've got to go add it to this extension. So there's a little bit of sort of give and take to think about if you're going to do multi-layered models in the extensibility space. Finally, in extensibility, template extensibility, we won't drain this one, like unless there's a request, but different templating engines have different capabilities to allow you to say, I imported somebody else's template, but I want to override this one little piece of it, right? Really, Jinja is first class in this in terms of templating engines and the ability to allow multiple different design patterns in how you do overrides to a template to affect the output, right? Because that's the challenge you get to, right? You can do all this magic, and then somebody says, hey, in this one SQL file, there's like this one thing I need to add at the end of the table declaration. And now you have a decision to make about, well, can I just add it in the file out here? Because as soon as I add it in the file out here, remember active versus passive code generation, I have a hard time regenerating that file as soon as a human changes it, right? Like oftentimes generated files, in the event that they get checked into source control, they'll have huge comments at the top, machine generated file, do not hand edit, right? And the reason why is you go make an edit out here, and then I want to go run this forward. There's only a couple of good patterns to capture your customization, and many of them require basically reparsing this output and bringing it back up into the model. And it's incredibly challenging, right? Jinja presents a couple of different ways to present extensions into this and do some overrides. It's pretty flexible, and really keeps you from that, like, how do I edit something out here and bring it all the way back? I think you can chase that if you want, but it's not something I'd suggest spending a ton of time on. It's incredibly difficult. So that covers reuse and extensibility. I think we kind of talked more about this. So I'm going to redraw this, erase a bunch, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time. We're going to make a whole one about GUIs and visual modeling. And we're probably going to talk about extracted metadata in the same one.